Hey guys, what's going on? So I just wanted to give my power rankings after 4 weeks of the NFL season so far. And this is going to be putting heavy emphasis on their record so far, in addition to who they've played and what they've done more recently. So at dead last, I do have the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think they're a much better team, but in reality, they are the only team in the NFL that hasn't won a game, regardless of other teams that may be in a worser situation due to injuries or whatnot. And they did have a couple of tough games, such as the Dolphins in week 1 when the Dolphins were at full power, in addition to the Texans last week, in addition to the Bills and the Browns. So it is pretty understandable that they're in this spot, but I think they maybe could have pulled off a win against the Browns or even an upset just to have something to show for. So really not off to a good start. And then just behind them, I'd have the Miami Dolphins. They just really don't seem the same without Tua Tagovailoa, and given that concussion, I don't know what exactly is going to come of him, but really regardless of if he comes back or decides to retire, they're just digging a further hole from themselves. But I am putting them above the Jaguars in this due to that record, and they did beat them in week 1. And then just following them, the Tennessee Titans. And while they did beat the Dolphins tonight, I don't really think that means too much. And then just above them, I would have the Cleveland Browns. And while I do think they have a good team on paper, again, only win was against the Jaguars, but still a close game. Really struggled against the Cowboys in the beginning. And then a semi-close game against the Giants, but they weren't able to do enough. And while I think they have a pretty good defense and even some offensive weapons, and you do have hopefully Nick Chubb coming back soon, I just really would like to see a lot more from their production. And then at 28, I would have the Carolina Panthers. I would have liked to see them beat the Bengals. It was somewhat of a close game, and I thought they had a little bit more new life in terms of starting Dalton, but it looks like they're still going to be struggling this year. And then you have to put the Bengals above them since they did just beat them, but really off to a rough start. I think this is one of the more surprising disappointments of the season so far. Tough games against the Chiefs and the Commanders, but starting the season off taking an L to the Patriots, I just think really sets them back, and I much rather would have seen them at 2-2. And then because the Patriots did beat them in week 1, even though I don't like the Patriots outlook for the season, nor do I like how they're playing, you have to put them above the Bengals in this. But just going on a 3-game loss streak against the Seahawks, the Jets, the 49ers, they are tough teams, and I would like to see the Patriots do a little bit more, but also given their history last year, I don't really think anything's looking too great. And then at 25, the New York Giants, and I think their offense is really coming into play now, especially the big story around Malik Nabers and his contribution so far, I think is really electric and really something to build from, but they're just still not doing enough to put a win together. We saw that Thursday with the Cowboys. Good win against the Browns, but also pretty tough competition against the Vikings in week 1 and the Commanders in week 2. So I think the Giants could still surprise us. Even if they don't make the playoffs, maybe they could end up finishing 500 or somewhere around there. So I think that'll be interesting to see. And then just above them, the Los Angeles Rams. And I think their win over the 49ers really sparked some excitement for the Rams' chances this season. But that loss against the Bears, I think, is really crucial and really devastating there. Pretty tough opening week against the Lions, and then the Cardinals. They were pretty injury prone, but they're still just going to have to find ways to win. And then I do have the Cardinals just right above them because they did beat them in week 2. But also 1-3 start for the Cardinals, I think, is a little bit disappointing. And I think especially with Harrison Jr., I do think the Cardinals have all of the tools for a really great offense, but you're just not getting enough of an outcome to win games. Pretty tough competition, though. You have the loss to the Bills, the Lions, and the Commanders, which are all on the higher end of this list. So I do think it's possible that the Cardinals have enough room to turn it around this season as well. And we're going to find out next week against San Francisco where they're really at. And then at 22, this is now going into the 2-2 category. I do have the Jets at the later end of this, starting off the season to a loss to the 49ers. I don't really think that's that much of a big deal, even though that game really wasn't too competitive. Did beat the Titans and the Patriots, but I don't think that's really too much to show for because they are underneath them on this list. And then that loss against the Broncos, I think is somewhat surprising. Maybe not, considering how the Broncos beat the Buccaneers the week prior and they're really turning it on. But I would have liked to see them get a win there, and you really can't put them above San Francisco, which is the next team on this list, because they did beat them already. And for the 49ers, I think the Vikings loss really wouldn't have been that bad if you're sitting at 3-1 right now going into the season, and then you'd be tied for first place with the Seahawks. But the loss to the Rams, I think, really hurt them, and given the Rams aren't looking too good this year, I think that's definitely something that they should have held on to in that game. And besides that, in terms of their wins, the Jets and the Patriots really isn't that impressive, and I would like to see them get some wins over better teams before I can move them up on this list. But obviously, following the NFC champions last year, I think the 49ers definitely have the potential to be one of the better teams in the league, but they're really just going to have to show that through their record and through these next coming weeks. And I do have the Raiders above the 49ers at 20. I think what's really impressive is that upset win over the Ravens, and given how well the Ravens beat the Bills, I think that's just really surprising how they were able to pull off a win there. But given what the Raiders have done beating the Chiefs last year, they're definitely capable of pulling up some upsets, and I think that 2-2 record is something that is a decent outlook for their season. You do have the loss to the Chargers and then the Panthers, I think, which really hurt them, but you do have Dalton really coming alive in his first start of the season. And then you also have a win over the Browns, which I think is good, but we're really just going to have to see how the Raiders pan out this year. And then I have the Los Angeles Chargers next. Also 2-2, and I think what hurts the Chargers is going on a 2-game losing streak, but you do have really tough competition against both the Steelers and the Chiefs in the past 2 weeks. The wins against the Raiders and the Panthers, I don't really think is that much to show for, but given how the Raiders beat the Ravens, I think that is a little bit more impressive for that week 1 win, but we're really just going to have to see how the Chargers are able to end up this year. And I also would like to see them score a little bit more too. And then at 18, I think this is a little bit surprising, but I am putting the Chicago Bears here. I am rewarding that win in the past week a little bit more than those 2 tough losses that the Chargers are coming off. And I think the Bears right now are in a position where it could really go either way. And really the loss to the Texans and the Colts, I think, isn't that bad in terms of those teams being pretty good this year. So I would like to see how the Chicago Bears are going to do. And I think you really have them figuring out how to use Swift, for example. And I would like to see how they're able to capitalize on that going forward. And they have so many wide receiver weapons. I really think the Bears do have the potential to be a great team this year. And then at 17, the Dallas Cowboys did win this week, but the Giants game I think was just a little bit closer than where it should have been. And really the 2-2 record I don't think does the Cowboys justice, because you have their loss to the Saints and the Ravens. And while the Saints are now also 2-2, I think the Cowboys are still on track to have a dominant team, but they do have a pretty tough schedule coming up in the next few weeks. So I think the Cowboys are going to have to win a lot of close games to be in a good spot for their division. And then Indianapolis at 16. Not really too sure if you're going to have Flacco for the rest of the year or Richardson. I think either way, they're still going to be a competitive team. Obviously, their losses to the Texans and the Packers. I think the Packers hurts a little bit more because you don't have Love in there, but the Packers still a really great team, and you have their wins against both the Bears and the Steelers. I think this last week is a really impressive win for the Colts, and I definitely think they have the potential to be a playoff caliber team. But you do have to put the Packers above them since they were able able to hold on without Love, even though he is back now. You obviously have the close game loss to the Eagles to open up the season, as well as the Vikings loss this past week, and it almost looked like the Packers were going to pull a comeback, so I really don't think those two losses really hurt their record in hindsight. And I do still think the Packers are a playoff caliber team this year as well. And then I do have the New Orleans Saints next. I think what really hurts them is losing 2 weeks in a row. That Falcons loss is really going to hurt them in their division, but they really just started so strong against both the Panthers and really the Cowboys game, which was a major upset. So I don't know if the Saints are really going to be able to hold on to that momentum given what happened the past 2 weeks if they're not able to play to the same caliber against tougher teams. But they're still going to be a team to look out for this season. But you do have to put the Eagles above them since they did get the better of them. I think the losses to the Falcons or the Bucks, I would have liked to see the Eagles win one of those. But the win against the Saints, I think, is really promising. And I really think the Eagles, especially with Brown and Smith back, they're going to really be able to utilize all of their offensive weapons. I think the big story has been how well Barkley has filled in for the Eagles this year. And I think they definitely have a playoff and even Super Bowl potential team given what they've done in the past. But I think they're just a little bit too inconsistent. At 12, this is a pretty surprising spot for them, but I am rewarding what the Denver Broncos have done recently. You started off 0-2, but the win against the Bucks, I think, was really impressive and one of the major upsets of this season, in addition to getting that win against the Jets the week after. And I would like to see them score a lot more, but I think you definitely have Bo Nix settling in and really finding a groove for this offense. And I definitely think this 2-game win streak is something that the Broncos could build on. And I definitely think they have the potential to be a great team this year if they're able to keep moving forward. And then I have the Atlanta Falcons at 11. Those 2 losses to the Steelers and the Chiefs really doesn't hurt them that much because they're right above them on this list. But the win against both the Eagles and the Saints, I think, is extremely impressive. And I think with Kirk Cousins, you definitely have the potential for a really great season. I think their close game win against the Eagles really showed how well they could do in a potential playoff game. But we're really going to have to see once they play the Buccaneers where they're at for the division. And then at 10, I have them as the best 2-2 team so far, the Baltimore Ravens. Really a rough start. Pretty close game loss to the Chiefs. Almost came back and beat them. And then you have the Raiders upset, which I think is really weird, especially given it was in Baltimore. But they were able to hold on against the Cowboys. And I really think you got to reward them for how they played this past week against the Bills. With the Bills looking like one of the better teams of this year, the Ravens just completely dismantled them. And I definitely think the Ravens are a really disastrous team to play against, especially once the game gets out of hand. You really got to keep them close because the Ravens really are an extremely physical team, especially now with Derrick Henry. And I think in terms of more of the long run, the real question is going to be, can the Ravens play like they did last week against the Chiefs? And especially in a pretty close playoff game. And then at 9, I have the Pittsburgh Steelers. A good 3-1 start, but I think their loss against the Colts could be the beginning of the end. Maybe they're still a playoff caliber team, but I just don't think they have enough weapons with how many points they're producing. But still a really good defensive performance. You have them beating the Falcons in week 1, as well as the Broncos, who are looking to be a good team, and the Chargers. Really nothing to complain about there, but we just need a few more games to get a bigger sample pool for their team this year. And then I have the Bills as the second worst 3-1 team on this list. Obviously, not even being competitive against the Ravens, I think, really hurts their chances this year, and especially if they play again in maybe the playoffs. I don't really see the Bills doing anything different. They're just going to have to hope that they're able to keep the game close. I do think you have a couple of impressive wins with the Cardinals, with the healthier version of the Dolphins, and then, of course, the blowout against the Jaguars. But if the Bills aren't able to compete against tougher teams, it's really hard to say how they're going to amount to this year. So that's why I have them on the lower end here. And then I have the Seahawks just above them. I think the real question is how the Seahawks do look against tougher competition. I think we got the answer against the Lions, and they did fight enough to keep themselves in the game, but I still think it was somewhat of a comfortable win for the Lions. So those wins against the Broncos, when you have Bo Nix starting his NFL career, and then the Patriots and the Dolphins without Tua, I don't really think you have enough to show from those 3 wins. I think especially when they play the 49ers, we'll get a much better idea of where they're at, but definitely showed potential. It's just still too early to put them any higher on this list. And then at 6, I have the Washington Commanders. I think they are one of the more surprising turnaround teams of this year. You have a really great start from Jaden Daniels, and I think he's definitely earned that franchise role if he's able to keep going. And I think their first loss against the Bucks really isn't that bad because they are going to be a dominant team this year. And then you have a couple of good wins against both the Giants and the Bengals. The Cardinals being a little bit more impressive of those 3 teams. I have the Lions at 5. Really looked electric, especially offensively against the Seahawks. I think everyone is really playing to their potential. And the Lions easily could have been in the Super Bowl last year had a few things gone differently. You just do have their close loss to the Buccaneers, which is why they're the 4th best team on this list. And I really think that loss against the Broncos is a little bit of a fluke, but it's definitely possible the Broncos are a competitive team this year. I easily could have seen the Buccaneers going 4-0 to start this season, and they definitely could have been on the top of this list. And I just think you have so much going right for the Buccaneers, but you just have to make sure they're going to be consistent this year given that Denver loss. And then I do have the Texans as the best 3-1 team so far. I think this is really just due to their loss against the Vikings not being that bad, since the Vikings are the best team on this list. But I would have liked to see them be a little bit more competitive there. For a really electric offense that the Texans are supposed to have, I would have liked to see them be more in the game. And then the only 2 undefeated teams, I have the Chiefs just below the Vikings. I think that's really just due to the nature of how they've won. Pretty close game against the Ravens, pretty close game against the Bengals, which I think is concerning given the 1-3 start for the Bengals so far. And then you have the Falcons, which wasn't a dominant win by any means. And then the Chargers 17-10. You do have them losing Rashee Rice, which could hurt them this year. So maybe they're going to look for some trades. You also have the Pacheco injury, but were the best team last year given their Super Bowl win. And they are going to have a fair share of tough tests. And I think given at this rate, maybe eventually they're going to catch a loss or 2 just given how close they're playing teams, but still an excellent team and dynasty. And then you got to give it to Minnesota. I think the really turnaround year from Sam Darnold getting another opportunity in his career, and he's definitely delivered on that. And the Vikings are just so vicious on all aspects of the ball in terms of strategy, in terms of their roster. And I really don't think anyone saw this coming. And I think in addition to those wins against really tough teams, you have the 49ers, the Texans, and the Packers all being really good playoff teams last year. And I think that definitely is impressive. I definitely think the Vikings are going to be the team to beat. I think the real question in the long run is going to be, can the Vikings keep this up? It is a little bit concerning that the Packers had them on the ropes towards the later half of that. And I think they are going to face their fair share of tough tests. And they definitely look to be the number 1 seed in the NFC. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if they can keep this up in the playoffs. So those would be my power rankings going into week 5, and a lot could change, especially after this week. So feel free to let me know your thoughts on these teams. Really appreciate you guys watching, and I'll see you later.